The fire was still smoldering in the yard when 14-year-old Cora Whitfield was shoved through the front door of her aunt's farmhouse with nothing but her dead mother's coat and a pair of shoes 2 sizes too big. Behind her, the last pages of her father's journals curled into black ash, and her Aunt Lenore stood on the porch with arms crossed, watching the smoke rise like it was something righteous. "No more of that nonsense under my roof," Lenore said. "Your daddy filled your head with foolishness, and I won't have it poisoning this house. You can find your own way from here." It was November of 1934, in the deep folds of the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, and the sky was already the color of iron. Cora stood at the edge of the dirt road, 14 years old, utterly alone, and watched the only home she had left disappear behind her aunt's slamming door. To understand how Cora Whitfield ended up standing in the cold with nothing, you have to understand where she came from. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, had been a school teacher and an amateur botanist, a man who believed that knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you. He had shelves of books in their small cabin outside of Briar Hollow, Virginia. Books on agriculture, on chemistry, on bread-making traditions from Europe and the old country. Her mother, Ada, had been the best baker in the county, a woman who could turn a handful of cornmeal and a bit of lard into something that tasted like it came from a fine city kitchen. Ada believed bread was a language. She said you could taste whether it was made with love or made with duty, and she taught Cora the difference before Cora could even see over the counter. When influenza took both Thomas and Ada in the winter of 1932, Cora was 12. She was sent to live with Aunt Lenore, her mother's older sister, a hard woman married to an even harder man named Buford, who ran a struggling tobacco farm. Lenore had never approved of Thomas Whitfield, a man who read books instead of plowing fields, who taught his daughter algebra and the Latin names of plants. In Lenore's world, a girl needed to know how to scrub floors, tend livestock, and keep her mouth shut. Cora could do the first 2, but she could not, would not, do the third. For 2 years, Cora lived in that house like a shadow. She did the work expected of her, feeding the chickens, hauling water, scrubbing the laundry on a board until her knuckles bled. But she also read. She had managed to save a small box of her father's books and journals, and she kept them hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her cot in the attic. At night, by the thin light of a stub of candle, she would read about soil composition, about the science of fermentation, about how wild yeast lived in the air all around us, invisible and alive. She read about how the great bakers of Vienna had used underground ovens to maintain steady temperatures. She read about root cellars and the way the earth itself could be an oven if you understood its principles. Lenore found the books on a Tuesday morning in November. Cora had been careless. She'd left one of her father's journals open on her cot, a page about sourdough starters and the chemistry of gluten development. Lenore couldn't read well, but she recognized the handwriting, and she recognized disobedience. By the time Cora came back from the henhouse, the books were burning in the yard, and Lenore was waiting for her on the porch. "I told you when you came here," Lenore said. "No more of that. Your daddy's books are what made him useless, and I won't have you turning out the same. You think you're better than us. You always have. Well, go be better somewhere else." Buford didn't even come outside. He just sat in his chair by the stove and let it happen. The neighbors saw. None of them said a word. If you want to find out how a 14-year-old girl who was thrown out with nothing but a coat and her mother's recipes in her memory built something that would eventually feed 3 villages through the hardest winters anyone could remember, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Cora Whitfield created in those mountains is one of the most remarkable stories of survival and generosity you'll ever hear. Cora walked. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to move or the cold would kill her. The temperature was already dropping, and the sky had that heavy, pressing look that meant snow. She pulled her mother's coat tighter. It was too big for her, made for a grown woman, and the sleeves hung past her fingertips, but it smelled like Ada. Faintly, underneath the years, it still smelled like flour and wood smoke and lavender, and that smell was the only thing keeping Cora from sitting down in the road and giving up. She followed the old logging road that wound up the mountain behind Briar Hollow, because it was the only direction that led away from people who had watched her books burn and said nothing. She passed the Hensley place, where Mrs. Hensley was hanging laundry, and saw Cora walking alone with no bag, no provisions, nothing. Mrs. Hensley paused with a wet shirt in her hands, looked at the girl, and then turned back to her clothesline. She didn't call out. She didn't ask where Cora was going. She just turned away, and that small act of looking and choosing not to see was something Cora would remember for the rest of her life. She walked for hours. The road narrowed to a track, and the track narrowed to a deer path, and the deer path disappeared into a thicket of rhododendrons so dense it blocked the wind. The light was fading now, and the first flakes of snow were falling, small and dry, the kind that meant serious cold was coming. Cora's feet were numb in her oversized shoes. Her hands were shaking. She knew, with the calm certainty of a girl who had read her father's books on wilderness survival, that she needed shelter within the hour, or she would not survive the night. She pushed through the rhododendron, scratching her hands and face on the thick, waxy leaves, and came out the other side into a clearing she had never seen before. What she found there stopped her dead. Set into the hillside was a stone structure, half buried in the earth, with a heavy wooden door hanging from one hinge. It looked like someone had dug into the mountain itself and built a room inside it. Beside it, a creek ran over a shelf of flat rock, and above it, the hillside rose steeply, covered in old hardwood trees. Cora could see the remains of a chimney poking up through the earth above the structure, and a set of stone steps leading down to the door. She pulled the door open and stepped inside, and the first thing she noticed was the warmth, not heat. There was no fire, no stove, but the air inside was noticeably warmer than outside. The earth itself was insulating the space, keeping it at a steady temperature that Cora's father would have called the constant. That unchanging warmth deep underground that stays the same, regardless of the season above. The room was about 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with stone walls and a packed earth floor. There was a stone hearth built into the far wall, with a chimney that rose up through the hillside. A wooden shelf ran along one wall, and on it sat a few rusted tins, a cracked bowl, and, Cora's heart leaped, an old iron Dutch oven, still solid despite years of neglect. There was a wooden table, rough-hewn but sturdy, and a bench. In the corner, a pile of old burlap sacks that might once have been bedding. Cora would later learn the history of this place. It had been built 20 years earlier by a man named Elias Marsh, a miner who had come to the mountains during the last of the iron ore days. Elias had understood the earth. He had built this dugout as a root cellar and shelter, using the natural insulation of the hillside to maintain a constant temperature year-round. He had lined the walls with stone to prevent collapse and built the hearth with a chimney that drew beautifully because of the natural draft created by the temperature difference between the underground room and the outside air. Elias had died in a mine collapse in 1920, and his shelter had been forgotten by everyone except the deer and the foxes. But Cora didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that she was out of the wind, and the iron pot was solid, and the hearth looked like it would hold a fire. She gathered wood from the fallen branches outside, and by nightfall she had a small fire burning and a roof over her head. That first night was the loneliest of her life. She lay on the burlap sacks, listening to the wind howl above her while the fire crackled, and she cried for her mother and father and the books that were now ash. But even as she cried, her mind was working. She was thinking about the steady temperature of the underground room. She was remembering what her father had written about the old European bakers who used underground ovens. She was thinking about her mother's sourdough starter, the way Ada had kept it alive for years in a crock on the back of the stove, feeding it flour and water, talking to it like it was a living thing. Because it was a living thing. Wild yeast, captured from the air, cultivated and fed and kept alive through patience and attention. Cora almost died that first week. She had no food, and the woods in November offered little. She ate the inner bark of birch trees, which her father had taught her was edible. She found a patch of late-season watercress growing along the creek. She caught a single trout with her bare hands, a feat that took her most of a day and left her soaked to the bone. She shivered through nights that dropped well below freezing above ground, though in her underground room, with the fire banked, the temperature stayed tolerable. On the 8th day, she found the flour. It was in a tin buried under a pile of rocks behind the shelter, Elias Marsh's emergency store, sealed tight and dry. It was old, but it was flour. Not much, maybe 10 pounds, but to Cora, it was a miracle. She also found a small tin of salt and a jug that had once held molasses, with a sticky residue still coating the inside. And that was when the idea took shape. Not just survival. Something more. Cora remembered everything her mother had taught her, and everything her father had written. She knew that sourdough starter could be created from nothing but flour and water and time. The wild yeast in the air would colonize the mixture if you were patient. She knew that the underground room maintained a temperature that was nearly perfect for fermentation. She knew that the stone hearth, if she built it up properly, could function as a baking oven. The thermal mass of the stone and earth would hold heat for hours after the fire burned down, creating the kind of steady, even baking temperature that her mother had always said was the secret to great bread. She mixed flour and water in the cracked bowl and set it on the shelf. Then she waited. It took 6 days. On the 6th morning, the mixture was bubbling, alive with the wild yeast that floated in the mountain air. Cora fed it more flour and water, and by the 8th day, she had a sourdough starter that smelled the way her mother's kitchen used to smell, sharp and sweet and alive. Her first loaf was terrible, dense, gummy in the center, with a crust that could have been used to hammer nails. But it was bread, and she ate it with tears running down her face, because it tasted like her mother. She could almost hear Ada's voice in the underground room, saying what she always said when a loaf didn't turn out right. Well, the yeast knows what it's doing, even when we don't. Try again tomorrow. She baked again, and again. She kept a mental log of every variable. How much water, how long the dough rose, how hot the oven was when she slid the loaf inside. She learned to read the dough with her hands, the way her mother had, feeling for the moment when it transformed from a shaggy, sticky mess into something smooth and alive and elastic beneath her fingers. Each loaf was better than the last, She learned the rhythms of the underground oven, how long to burn the fire before raking out the coals, how to test the temperature by holding her hand inside and counting, how to use the steam from a pan of water to create the crisp crust her mother had been famous for. She discovered that the hard mountain water, rich in minerals from the limestone creek bed, gave her bread a flavor and texture that soft water never could. By the end of November, she was baking loaves that would have made Ada Whitfield proud. But bread requires flour, and her supply of Elias Marsh's emergency store was running low. Cora needed a plan. That plan came in the form of Dotie Sayers, a 72-year-old woman who lived alone in a cabin 3 miles down the mountain. Dotie had been a midwife for 40 years, and she knew every hollow and ridge in those mountains. She had known about Elias Marsh's dugout. She had delivered Elias's wife's stillborn child there in 1918. And when she spotted thin smoke rising from a hillside where no smoke should be, she came to investigate. Dotie found Cora baking bread in an underground room and didn't even blink. She was the kind of woman who had seen too much of life to be surprised by any of it. She sat down on the bench, accepted a slice of bread, chewed it slowly, and said, "Your mama teach you this?" "Yes, ma'am." "She teach you good." Dotie became Cora's lifeline. She brought flour, cornmeal, lard, and salt. Not charity, she insisted, but trade, because Dotie had bad knees and couldn't bake anymore, and she missed good bread. She also brought Cora a wool blanket, a proper knife, and something even more valuable: knowledge. Dotie knew which plants in the mountain woods were edible, which were medicinal, and which would kill you. She taught Cora to identify ramps in the spring, to harvest black walnuts in the fall, to dry apples on a rack above the fire. She taught her how to make ash cakes and persimmon bread and a type of chestnut flour that the old mountain people had used before the blight killed the American chestnut. In return, Cora baked, and she experimented. The underground room, with its constant temperature, was perfect not just for baking, but for fermentation of all kinds. She began making vinegar from wild apples. She fermented sauerkraut from the wild cabbage that grew along the creek bottom. She discovered that the back corner of the underground room, where the temperature was coolest, was ideal for aging cheese if she could get milk. Dotie arranged that too, trading a neighbor's goat milk for bread. Through that first winter, Cora nearly died twice more. Once from a fever that Dotie treated with willow bark tea and a poultice of herbs, once from a partial collapse of the entrance to her underground room after a heavy snowfall, which trapped her inside for 2 days before Dotie came looking. But each crisis taught her something. She reinforced the entrance with heavy timbers scavenged from an old barn. She built a second air shaft to prevent being trapped again. She stockpiled firewood and dried food against future emergencies. By spring of 1935, Cora had not just survived. She had built a functioning underground bakery. She expanded the original room, digging deeper into the hillside to create a second chamber for storage. She built a proper baking oven within the hearth, using the flat creek stones that held heat beautifully. She constructed a simple wooden trough for mixing dough and carved a peel from a plank of oak for sliding loaves in and out of the oven. Word spread the way it does in mountain communities. Slowly, through the talk of old women and the curiosity of children, a hunter named Grady Pruitt followed the smell of baking bread up the mountain one April morning and found Cora pulling loaves from her underground oven. He traded her 2 rabbits for a loaf and told everyone in Briar Hollow about the girl living in the mountain who baked bread like an angel. Some people laughed, some people shook their heads. A few came to see for themselves. What they found amazed them. By the summer of 1935, Cora had not just a bakery, but a garden. She had cleared the land around the entrance to her underground room and planted it with seeds Dotie had given her. Beans, squash, tomatoes, herbs. She had built a series of small terraces on the hillside, using the stone wall technique her father had described in one of his burned journals, knowledge she carried in her memory even though the pages were gone. She had diverted water from the creek through a simple channel to irrigate her garden. She was 15 years old, and she was feeding herself entirely from what she grew and baked. The first people who came to trade were the poorest families from the surrounding hollows, people who had less than nothing, who were surviving on cornbread and desperation. Cora didn't turn anyone away. If they had nothing to trade, she gave them bread anyway. If they had a handful of dried beans or a few eggs, she took those. She kept a mental ledger, but she never pressed for repayment. Her mother had taught her that bread was meant to be shared, and she held to that teaching like a commandment. By 1936, Cora's underground bakery was supplying bread to families in 3 villages: Briar Hollow, Pine Creek, and the tiny settlement of Moss Gap. She had expanded her operation to include 4 different types of bread: her mother's sourdough, a dark rye made with grain she traded for from a farmer in the valley, a cornmeal loaf sweetened with sorghum, and a chestnut bread made from the flour Dotie had taught her to grind. She was also producing fermented vegetables, vinegar, and a soft goat cheese that people walked miles to buy. She did all of this from an underground room in the side of a mountain, using techniques that combined her father's scientific knowledge, her mother's baking traditions, and her own relentless experimentation. The underground environment gave her advantages that no above-ground bakery could match. The constant temperature meant her sourdough starter never died from cold or overheated in summer. The thermal mass of the earth and stone meant her oven held a steady baking temperature for hours. The natural humidity of the underground space kept her bread fresh longer than any bread baked in a dry kitchen. And then came the winter of 1936, the worst winter anyone in the Blue Ridge could remember. Snow fell for weeks without stopping. Temperatures dropped so low that trees split with sounds like gunshots. Livestock froze in barns. Roads became impassable, and food ran out. In Briar Hollow, people were starving. The families who had looked down on Cora, who had watched Lenore burn her books and said nothing, who had whispered about the strange girl living in the mountain. Those families were now desperate. Their root cellars were empty. Their flour was gone. Their children were hungry. Cora heard about it from Grady Pruitt, who snowshoed up the mountain to tell her. She didn't hesitate. She had spent the autumn stockpiling flour, cornmeal, and dried goods, preparing for winter the way her father's journals had taught her, with the careful planning of someone who understood that nature was generous but not forgiving. She had enough to last herself through spring. She also had enough to share. For 6 weeks, Cora baked through the night, every night. She produced dozens of loaves a day: sourdough, cornbread, rye. And Grady and 2 other men she trusted carried them down the mountain on sleds to distribute to the families in all 3 villages. She sent jars of fermented vegetables and crocks of cheese. She sent dried herbs for tea. She sent everything she could spare, and some things she couldn't. Among the families she fed was Lenore and Buford's. Their tobacco crop had failed the previous summer, and they had nothing stored. When Lenore received a loaf of Cora's bread, delivered by Grady Pruitt with a simple note that said, "From Cora," she sat down at her kitchen table and wept. Spring came. The snow melted, and people came up the mountain, not just to trade but to learn. They wanted to know how a girl alone in an underground room had been the only person in 3 villages who was prepared for the worst winter in memory. Cora taught them. She showed them how to build root cellars that maintained constant temperatures. She taught them fermentation, how to preserve cabbage and beans and turnips so they lasted through winter. She shared her sourdough starter, giving pieces of it to anyone who wanted to learn to bake. She taught them the science behind the traditions, the way her father would have, explaining why things worked, not just how. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, showing them the way heat moved through stone and earth, showing them why a properly insulated root cellar stayed at 55 degrees, whether it was 90 above or 20 below. The men nodded slowly. The women took notes on scraps of paper. The children watched with wide eyes, and Cora saw in some of those children the same hunger she had felt, the hunger to understand, to know why, to see the invisible workings of the world. She helped 12 families build underground root cellars that spring and summer. She showed them how to site them on north-facing slopes for natural cooling, how to line them with stone for thermal mass, how to install ventilation pipes so the air stayed fresh. She taught them to think about food storage not as a chore, but as a science, and the families who listened, really listened, never went hungry again. Lenore came to see her in April of 1937. She climbed the mountain path slowly, her bad hip making the journey painful, and she stood at the entrance to Cora's underground bakery and looked at what her niece had built. She didn't apologize. Lenore wasn't the kind of woman who had those words in her. But she said, "Your mama would have been proud of you. I was wrong about the books." It was the closest thing to an apology Cora would ever receive, and she accepted it with a nod and a loaf of fresh bread, still warm from the oven. Cora Whitfield never left her mountain. Over the years, she expanded the underground bakery into a complex of rooms, a baking chamber, a fermentation room, a cheese cave, a root cellar, and a teaching kitchen where she showed young people the arts she had mastered. In 1941, she married a man named James Everett, a quiet carpenter who had first come up the mountain to repair her door and stayed because he recognized in Cora a kind of strength he had never seen before. Together, they had 3 children, and all of them grew up knowing how to bake bread and tend a garden and read books without apology. During the war years, Cora's bakery became even more important. With rationing and shortages affecting everyone, her sourdough bread, which required no commercial yeast, no sugar, no milk, became a staple for families across the region. She trained dozens of women in sourdough baking, and her starter, descended from that first batch she had cultured in a cracked bowl in 1934, spread across 3 counties. Dottie Sayers died in 1943 at the age of 81 in her cabin with Cora beside her. She left Cora her cabin, her land, and a cigar box containing $47, a fortune by mountain standards. Cora used the money to buy a proper millstone and began grinding her own flour from locally grown grain, completing a cycle of self-sufficiency that her father would have marveled at. By the 1950s, Cora's underground bakery had become something of a legend. People drove from as far away as Roanoke and Charlottesville to buy her bread. A professor from the University of Virginia came to study her underground baking methods and published a paper on the thermal properties of earth-sheltered structures, citing Cora's bakery as one of the most efficient food production environments he had ever documented. A newspaper in Richmond ran a story about her with the headline, "Mountain Woman Bakes Bread Underground," and for a few weeks, Cora had more customers than she could handle. But she never commercialized her operation. She never moved to town. She never built an above-ground bakery with modern equipment, though she could have afforded to. She stayed in her mountain, in her underground rooms, baking bread the way her mother had taught her and teaching anyone who wanted to learn. She said that the bread tasted better when it was baked in the earth, and maybe she was right. People who tasted it said there was something in it they couldn't name. A depth, a complexity, a warmth that came from somewhere beyond the recipe. Cora believed it was the mountain itself, the wild yeast that had lived in that hollow for centuries, the mineral water from the limestone creek, the steady heartbeat warmth of the earth around her oven. She believed the bread carried the mountain in it, and that was why people kept coming back. In the 1960s, Cora began a tradition that would outlast her. Every Saturday morning, she baked an extra dozen loaves and gave them away free to anyone who came up the mountain path. She called it her mother's bread, and she made only one request of the people who took it, that they share something they knew with someone who needed to learn it. A skill, a recipe, a story, a bit of knowledge. She said that was the real currency. Not money, not flour, not trade goods, but knowledge passed from hand to hand, the way her father had passed it to her, the way her mother had placed her small hands on a ball of dough and shown her what bread could be. Cora Whitfield died in her sleep in the winter of 1997, at the age of 77, in the cabin that had once been Dottie Sayers. Her sourdough starter, by then 63 years old, was divided among her 3 children and 14 grandchildren. Her underground bakery was preserved as a local heritage site, and her family still operates it today, baking bread every Saturday morning using Cora's original recipes and her original oven. The flour in that oven is still dusted with the same wild yeast that Cora captured from the mountain air in 1934, the same invisible, living thing that a frightened girl in a dead man's root cellar trusted to turn flour and water into bread, into survival, into a life. Here is what I think about when I think about Cora Whitfield. I think about a girl whose books were burned and who carried the knowledge from those books in her memory. I think about a girl who was told she was too curious, too different, too much, and who turned out to be exactly enough. I think about the fact that every quality Lenore despised in Cora, her reading, her questions, her refusal to stop learning, was the exact quality that saved not just Cora's life, but the lives of the people who had thrown her away. Have you ever been told that the thing that makes you different is the thing that makes you wrong? Have you ever been punished for being curious, for wanting more, for refusing to be small? Because if you have, Cora Whitfield's story is your story too. The world will always have people who want to burn your books. The question is whether you carry the knowledge with you anyway. Cora didn't build her underground bakery to prove anyone wrong. She built it to survive. But in surviving, she proved something that no one could argue with, that the girl they threw away was the one who fed them all. If this story resonated with you, if you know what it's like to be underestimated or cast aside, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Share it with someone who needs to hear that being different isn't a flaw. It's a gift. Because Cora Whitfield, the girl who was thrown out for loving books, spent 63 years baking bread underground, and in all that time, she never once stopped feeding the people who had let her go.